The widow had learned long ago that silence was louder than gunfire. It hung over her ranch like dust that never settled, stretching across the plains where grass bent low and dreams bent lower. Folks called her many things: cold, cursed, proud, but never weak. Not since the day her husband was buried beneath a lone mesquite tree. Not since the day the black stallion screamed like thunder and tore free from every hand that dared touch him. The ranch had once been alive with laughter, boots on wood, and horses breathing warm into the morning air. Now it was a place men rode into with swagger and rode out of with shame. The stallion stood at the heart of it all, tall and black as a moonless night, eyes burning with something no bridle had ever mastered. He was not just a horse. He was a verdict, and the widow had made him one. She stood on the porch most mornings, black dress pulled tight by the wind, watching the horizon, like it owed her answers. When men arrived, and they always did, she let them talk. She let them boast of broken broncs and won prizes, of bloodlines and scars. Then she said the same words every time, calm as a prayer carved in stone: if you're a real cowboy, prove it on my stallion. 25 men had taken that challenge. 25 had failed. Some were thrown within seconds, some dragged until their pride snapped before their bones did, and a few too stubborn for their own good left pieces of themselves in the dirt. The stallion accepted no rider. He bucked with fury, twisted with intelligence, and struck with hooves like he remembered every cruelty man had ever dealt his kind. The widow never smiled when they fell. She never mocked them. She simply turned away, as if each failure confirmed something she already knew, that some things were not meant to be conquered, and some hearts could not be trusted again. Word of the ranch spread like wildfire through saloons and cattle camps, growing larger with every telling. The stallion became legend. The widow became myth. Men came not just to win her land or her approval, but to defeat the idea that there was something in this world they could not tame. Each one failed in his own way. One cried when he hit the ground. Another cursed God. One begged her to sell the horse. Another offered money, then threats. She answered none of them. Nights found her alone, sitting by the window with a lamp barely burning, listening to the stallion's restless movements in the corral. Sometimes she spoke to him softly, not as a master, but as a mourner. She knew loss when she heard it breathing. She knew rage when she saw it pacing. And she knew loneliness because it lived in her chest like a second heart. The ranch was not a challenge to her, it was a test she had already failed once. When she trusted love and buried it in the ground, she told herself the stallion was the last thing her husband left behind that still refused to bow. And as long as he remained untamed, so would her grief. Men came and went, seasons changed, and still the stallion stood unbeaten, mane whipping like a banner of defiance. Then, one evening, when the sun bled red across the plains and the wind carried the smell of rain, a stranger rode in without asking permission. He didn't look like the others. There was no loud greeting, no confident grin, no polished bravado. Riding ahead of him, his horse was plain, his clothes worn thin by time rather than fashion. He dismounted slowly, as if listening to the land before stepping on it, and tied his reins without haste. The widow watched from the porch, expecting the usual speech, the familiar arrogance. It never came. The man simply stood there, head in hand, eyes scanning the ranch not with hunger, but with recognition, like someone returning to a place they had once lost. He had the posture of a man who had been knocked down enough times to stop announcing himself to the world. When he finally looked up at her, there was no challenge in his gaze, only a quiet steadiness that unsettled her more than any boast ever had. She spoke first, because silence had taught her when to strike. She gave him the words she had given them all, sharp and tested: if you're a real cowboy, prove it on my stallion. The man did not smile. He did not step forward. He only nodded once, as if she had said something obvious, something already decided. That was when she noticed his hands, scarred, steady, unshaking. Hands that knew pain but were not ruled by it. He asked no questions. He did not ask about the other men. He did not ask about her. He walked toward the corral as if the stallion had already called him by name. The black horse lifted his head, nostrils flaring, muscles tightening for the fight he had never lost. For the first time in years, The widow felt something stir beneath her ribs, not hope, not fear, but a dangerous curiosity. The lonely cowboy stepped into the dust, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. The corral felt smaller once the lonely cowboy stepped inside it, as if the earth itself leaned inward to witness what was about to happen. Dust clung to the air, stirred by the restless stamping of the stallion's hooves. The black horse circled him, muscles coiled like drawn wire, eyes bright with a fury sharpened by years of resistance. Men had rushed him before. Men had shouted, cursed, cracked reins, and lunged with foolish confidence. This man did none of that. He stood still, hat tucked beneath his arm, boots planted as though the ground belonged to him only because he respected it. The stallion snorted, testing him, then charged in a sudden blur of motion meant to break nerve before bone. The cowboy did not retreat. He turned sideways at the last moment, hand rising not to strike but to steady, fingers brushing air, where a lesser man would have grabbed mane too soon. The horse reared, hooves slicing the sky, a scream tearing from his chest that echoed across the ranch. From the porch, the widow felt her breath lock in her throat. She had seen this dance before, the first rush, the false opening, the moment when courage cracked. But the cowboy waited. He waited through the dust and thunder, through the stallion's rage, through the memory of pain written into every inch of that powerful body. When he finally reached for the reins, he did it slowly, deliberately, as if asking rather than taking. The stallion exploded beneath him when he mounted, bucking with a violence that sent shockwaves through the fence posts. The world became motion, twisting, slamming, screaming motion, and the cowboy became a part of it. Not a conqueror, but a survivor clinging to rhythm instead of dominance. Every buck was an attempt to erase him. Every landing threatened to shatter spine and pride alike. Yet he stayed, teeth clenched, eyes focused not on winning, but on enduring. He did not fight the stallion's anger. He rode with it, absorbing each violent protest like a confession finally allowed to surface. Minutes stretched into an eternity of strain. The stallion's strength was monstrous, but rage, like fire, consumes itself if it burns too long. The widow watched with hands pressed to the porch rail, heart pounding harder than it had in years. She remembered the men who fell screaming, the ones who cursed her, the ones who crawled away broken in body or spirit. She remembered her husband, strong and laughing, promising forever with dirt still under his nails. She remembered the night the stallion had broken loose, wild-eyed and bleeding, after the accident that stole her world. No man had ever stayed on him this long. No man had ever ridden without trying to break something first. The cowboy's face was streaked with dust and sweat now, pain etched deep into his jaw. But there was no fear in him, only a stubborn, aching resolve that spoke of a man who had already lost everything worth boasting about. When the stallion finally slowed, chest heaving, muscles trembling under their shared exhaustion, something changed. It wasn't surrender, it was recognition. The horse stopped fighting not because he was beaten, but because the fight no longer made sense. The cowboy slid from his back, landing hard but upright, one hand resting briefly against the stallion's neck. The touch was light, respectful. The stallion did not strike. He did not rear. He stood there breathing, eyes still fierce, but no longer alone in his fury. Silence fell heavier than before. The widow descended the porch steps slowly, each one feeling like a crossing she had avoided for too long. The cowboy turned toward her, shoulders sagging with exhaustion, and for the first time she saw how deeply tired he was, not just from the ride, but from life itself. He said nothing. He did not demand victory or reward. He did not look at her like a prize. That was when she understood why he had succeeded where 25 men had failed. He had not come to prove anything. He had come because he knew what it meant to be thrown, to be trampled by fate, and to get back up without applause. The stallion shifted beside him, calm now, as if some ancient debt had finally been acknowledged. The widow felt the tight knot inside her chest loosen, just enough to hurt. "You can stay," she said, the words trembling despite her effort to keep them steady. The cowboy nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the land, the ranch no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a place that had survived something terrible and was, at last, ready to heal. The stallion stood quiet in the fading light. The widow stood beside the man who had not tried to conquer him, and for the first time since grief had claimed her life, the silence did not feel so loud. Morning came differently on the ranch after the stallion was ridden. The light felt softer, less like an interrogation and more like an invitation. The widow awoke before dawn, as she always had, but for the first time in years she did not brace herself for the weight of the day. From the window she saw the cowboy already awake, moving slow through his chores, every action deliberate, unshowy, as if he belonged there without needing permission. The stallion stood near him in the corral, untied, unchallenged, watching. The man with wary calm. There was no rope between them, no fence of fear, only space and understanding. That sight unsettled her more than the ride had. She had built her life on boundaries between herself and men, between memory and hope, between grief and whatever dared come after it. Yet here was a man who crossed none of them by force, and still stood on the other side. When he finally noticed her watching, he tipped his hat slightly, not as a greeting, but as an acknowledgement, and went back to his work. No claim, no expectation. That was when she realized the ranch was changing, not because the stallion had been ridden, but because someone had stayed. As the day unfolded, neighbors came riding in, drawn by rumor like moths to flame. They stared at the stallion standing calm, at the cowboy mending fence beside him, and at the widow no longer dressed entirely in black. Questions hovered thick in the air, but answers were few. The cowboy did not tell his story. The widow did not explain herself. Some things, she understood now, lost their truth when spoken to loudly. The past, however, does not loosen its grip easily. By nightfall, a man rode in who carried old debts in his eyes. He had been among the 25. He had fallen hard, broken more than bone, and never forgiven the ranch for surviving him. He accused the cowboy of trickery, of weakness disguised as patience. He accused the widow of betrayal, of changing the rules after too many men bled for them. The tension cut sharp, the kind that demanded violence to resolve it. The cowboy stepped forward before the widow could speak, his voice low but steady, offering no insult, no defense. He simply said the truth as he lived it, that nothing worth keeping was won by breaking it first. The other man scoffed, hand drifting toward his gun, pride screaming louder than sense. The stallion shifted then, stepping between them, ears pinned, a living line drawn in dust. In that moment, the widow understood the full measure of what had changed. The stallion was no longer guarding her grief. He was guarding the peace she had forgotten she deserved. The man left in anger, dust rising behind him like a warning. But the threat faded with distance. What remained was choice. The widow faced the cowboy under the stars, her voice quieter than ever. She told him he did not owe her anything, that he was free to ride on, legend already written in whispers. He listened, then shook his head slowly. He told her freedom was not found in endless roads, but in places that asked you to stay when leaving would be easier. He told her he was tired of surviving and ready to belong. Seasons turned. Grass grew thick where blood and dust once ruled. The stallion became a symbol not of challenge but of balance. Ridden sometimes, left alone often, respected always. The widow learned to laugh again, softly at first, as if testing whether the sound still fit her. The cowboy learned to sleep without one eye open. Together they rebuilt not just fences and barns, but a way of living that honored loss without going to it. People still spoke of the challenge, of the 25 who failed, and the lonely cowboy who won. But the truth was quieter and far stronger. No one had been conquered. Not the stallion, not the widow, not the man who stayed. What had been proven was something rarer than strength, that patience could outlast fury, that respect could heal what force never could, and that sometimes the bravest thing a cowboy can do is dismount and choose to remain. When the widow stood on the porch now, watching the sun rise over land that no longer felt cursed, she no longer asked men to prove themselves. The ranch no longer needed proof. It had become something better than a legend. It had become a home. Time did not rush the ranch anymore. It moved the way it was meant to, slow, deliberate, shaped by weather and work rather than wounds. The widow noticed it first in the smallest things. The way she no longer startled at footsteps behind her. The way evenings stretched instead of pressed in. The way silence now rested instead of accused. The cowboy became part of the land so naturally that visitors sometimes forgot he had ever arrived at all. He fixed what was broken without announcing it, listened more than he spoke, and treated every animal like it remembered something older than either of them. The stallion followed him at a distance, never tamed in the way men bragged about, but bound by a quieter agreement. Some mornings the cowboy rode him across the far fields, not to prove mastery but to feel the wind carve through memory. Other mornings he left him free, standing together at the fence line, to survivors watching the sun climb. The widow began to ride again too, at first cautiously, then with a confidence she thought grief had stolen forever. Laughter returned to the ranch, not loud or careless, but real, the kind that comes from knowing pain and choosing joy anyway. Word spread, as it always does, but differently now. The ranch was no longer a place of defeat. It was spoken of with respect, even reverence, like a lesson men wished they'd learned earlier in life. Trouble, though quieter, never truly disappears. One autumn evening, riders appeared on the horizon, strangers with sharp eyes and sharper intentions. They came not for the stallion alone, but for what he represented: value, legend, ownership. They offered money first, then pressure, then threats disguised as reason. The widow felt the old tension rise, the instinct to harden, to retreat behind iron resolve. But she was no longer alone in that weight. The cowboy stood beside her, not shielding her, not speaking for her, just present. When the men tried to assert dominance, he met them with calm that cut deeper than bravado. He told them the truth without ornament, that nothing on this land was for sale if it required breaking trust to claim it. The stallion sensed the shift, moving forward with ears pinned, not aggressive but unmistakably firm. The message landed. Legends lose their shine when faced with quiet certainty. The riders left, not defeated, but deterred, aware that this place was no longer guarded by grief or challenge, but by unity. That night, under a sky thick with stars, the widow admitted something she had never said aloud, that for a long time she had used the stallion to keep the world away, to punish men for a loss they did not cause. The cowboy listened without judgment, because he understood survival strategies forged in pain. He told her he had done the same once, wandering from place to place, daring the world to prove it deserved him. They did not promise forever. They did not need to. What they shared was choice, renewed each day. Years later, people would still tell the story, though time softened its edges. They would say 25 men failed and one lonely cowboy won. And that part was true enough to remember. But the widow knew better. Winning had never been the point. What endured was the moment she stopped asking men to prove themselves and allowed herself to be seen. What endured was a stallion who was never broken, only understood. What endured was a man who stayed not because he had conquered, but because he had been welcomed. On quiet evenings, when the light turned the fields gold and the wind carried old songs through the grass, the widow would stand on the porch and watch the two figures moving in harmony. Across the land, horse and man, free and bound by trust. The ranch no longer echoed with failure. It breathed with life. And in that breathing, the widow finally understood the truth that had waited all along. Strength is not proven in conquest, but revealed in compassion, and the loneliest hearts are often the ones most capable of building a home.